Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on this very beautiful Tuesday, November 12th, 2024, for yet another episode of Developing a National Human Capital Policy. How have you been? How have your weeks been? Wherever you're joining us from the world, we hope you've had a good week thus far. And for those of us who are joining us from the United States, we can say finally it is done and done with. Finally, the election results are in. We know who has won. At the presidential level, we are knowing who is winning at the Senate and House of Representative levels. Meanwhile, for those, I think in Japan, if I'm not wrong, we also heard that the current leader has been able to find his way back into power. Like I said last week, a lot of elections are going on, and the reason why this is important is so that you can know what this means for you, whether you're a policy maker, you're a policy influencer, or you are even a policy demander occupying the highest office of the land, which is the office of the citizen. You need to know what its implications are, and that is part of why we do what we do on Amoge Radio Communications. My name is Tolu Omadara. It's such a joy, such a delight, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. We're going to have another exciting conversation, beginning as we always do, the recap on last week's highlights. Remember, again, the program is developing a national human capital policy. My name is Tolu Omadara, and we would be reviewing some of the highlights of last week's episode. Now, last week, we had transitioned into looking at the nation of India, trying to look at them as some kind of a case study, looking at what they did to get into where they are as what might be described as a knowledge economy, right? What did they do right? How did they get there, right? How did it begin for them? And part of the things we noticed was that, or part of the things we discussed, part of the things we highlighted is that to begin with, what is a knowledge economy? Right? A knowledge economy, like we said last week, is an economy that creates, disseminates, and uses knowledge to enhance its growth and development. I repeat, a knowledge economy is an economy that creates, disseminates, and uses knowledge to enhance its growth and development. Now, before I begin the recap fully, you might be asking, what is the relevance of a knowledge economy? Why exactly is a knowledge economy important? What makes a knowledge economy special? Well, let me let you know that empirical evidence already states or indicates that countries with higher income are those whose workers are most educated. I repeat, countries with higher income are those whose workers are most educated. In other words, countries where the workers are able to contribute to the creation, dissemination, and use of knowledge for growth and development are countries that have been found to be those with the most income. I'll say that again. Countries with the most educated workers have been empirically found to be the countries with the highest income. In other words, countries whose workers are positioned to create, disseminate, and use knowledge have been found to be the, so to say, richest countries of the world. Again, this is very important because we are talking about developing a national human capital policy. And when you're developing a national human capital policy, you should be creating that policy for your nation to operate at the competitive end of the global value chain. It's not about working hard. In other words, it's about working smart, right? A national human capital policy is supposed to help your country, you're supposed to help your economy to engage at the more competitive end of the global value chain, right? If your country has oil, for instance, where you're digging out the oil in its raw form and it's sent out elsewhere to be processed, the nations where the oil is being processed are likely to have the better end of the stick. They are likely to be competing at the more or operating at the more competitive edge of the global value chain, and eventually such nations will export those processed products, right? The end products that have been processed, sometimes ironically, back to the same nations where the raw materials were initially drilled from. Now, is it that the countries where the raw materials were taken from are not operating on the global value chain? They are, but unfortunately, due to a lack of knowledge, for instance, in manufacturing, for instance, in technology, for instance, in oil processing, unfortunately, those nations are operating at the lower end, at the less competitive end of the global value chain. And that is where the knowledge economy comes. I hope I'm breaking it down today. It's really important for you to know why we are looking at the knowledge economy. When looking at a national human capital policy, we want you to understand, like we said last week, that you are supposed to develop a national human capital policy that is in line with your national economic policy, right? It's almost assumed that we should know, just like you develop a human capital strategy in order to achieve your organizational strategy. A national human capital policy is supposed to be created to facilitate and accelerate the attainment of a nation's economic developmental goals. This presupposes, of course, like we said last week, that those economic and developmental goals have been clearly stated to begin with. These were some of the highlights of the last week, right? The purpose of creating a national human capital policy is ensuring that there is an alignment between the economic and development policies and the national human capital policies. Again, I want to state, like we said last week, that this presupposes that the economic and developmental goals have been clearly articulated and, permit me to add, also effectively communicated. My name is Tito Madara. This is Amoge Radio Communications. This beautiful Tuesday, November 12, 2024, and this program is developing a national human capital policy. It's great to have you with us. Now, going back to the India example, remember, I kind of explained why it's important to look at why India has been successful in creating a knowledge economy. And that's why I had to explain what is the importance of a knowledge economy. In the absence of a knowledge economy, your nation may be working hard, but forgive me if you find it uncomfortable, but the truth is it may not be working smart. It's not just about working hard, it's also about working smart. And that's what a knowledge economy does. Like the report I indicated, like the report I referenced indicated, nations that work smarter, nations with more educated workers, nations that have the ability to create a knowledge economy have been empirically demonstrated to be nations with higher incomes, hence the need for a knowledge economy. So going back to India again and still capturing some of the highlights from last week, there was a pioneering 2005 World Bank report that looked at India and the knowledge economy and observed that it was time for India to transition to knowledge economy. Remember, this was in 2005, almost 20 years ago, right? And they saw that, okay, India had the potential, right? But one of the important things was that having identified the potential, India then had to look and say, okay, what can we do to ensure that we move from potential to performance, right? So India ensured that the broad policy potential was detailed into performance requirements. Please take note of that word. It was a word I emphasized a lot. When it comes to execution, right, it's a whole new kettle of fish. It's one thing to have beautiful policies. I've heard it said of nations like Nigeria that policy formulation is not a problem, but policy implementation. Many times when you go into conversations with policymakers or policy knowers, we have that policy. I've experienced it. I've been in public sector reform for over a decade. You'll be surprised how many, we have that plan written somewhere, but what happens with implementation? And this is where they say that this is why it is said that the devil is in the details. It's one thing for you to have the broad policy goals, it's another thing for you to detail the specific performance requirements that will ensure that you move as a nation from policy formulation to policy implementation. So India did not just stop at that World Bank report that showed that they had the potential to transition into a knowledge economy. They then sat down to say, what are the policy requirements, the performance requirements that would guarantee or heighten the chances of this potential translating into performance? And 4 critical pillars of a knowledge economy were identified. We talked about this last week, so I'm not going to go into the details. I'm simply going to highlight them. 4 critical pillars of a knowledge economy were identified that need to be established in order for India's potential to be able to translate into performance. The first was strengthening economic and institutional frameworks. I repeat, strengthening the economic and institutional frameworks. This you might want to tag as structure. The second was developing educated and skilled workers. Very important. I remember saying excitedly last week that any lay person would have thought that the skills would come before the structure, but no. In order to ensure predictable, sustainable progress, the structure must always come first. So the very first pillar was strengthening economic and institutional frameworks. After that pillar came developing educated and skilled workers. In other words, after the structure, must come the people. The third one was create an efficient innovation management system, right? Because once you have the structure and you have the skills, there must now be a system for harnessing and optimizing the innovative output. I gave the example of Portugal. After they invested heavily in ensuring that they increased the number of PhD holders in science and technology, they then went on to be monitoring how many papers they were writing, how many innovative outputs they were eking out, how these were getting to international conferences, international platforms, how much of this was being utilized, not to talk of being optimized. And the more they tracked this data, the more they found out that their absorptive capacity increased. Absorptive capacity, by the way, means the ability to translate your science and technology output into economic and social development. Extremely important. I remember saying last week that is a whole conversation on its own. Some nations have scientific output, but they have not managed to translate those scientific outputs into optimal economic and social development. That is where the third pillar comes in, creating an efficient innovation system. So we have the structure. We also have the skills. That's the people. Now that we have the skills, we have the capabilities, we have the competencies, we have the capacities, it is now important to ensure that we also then have the systems to harness and to optimize the innovative outputs that is hopefully being generated by the skills. And last but definitely not the least, the fourth pillar was building a dynamic information infrastructure. Extremely important. Building a dynamic information infrastructure. What this does is that those innovative outputs, right, that have been managed, that have been captured, let me use the word captured, must now be translated into the most attractive and accessible information possible. I remember giving the example of Google. Today, it is very easy for anyone who does not know to assume that Google is the only search engine. But no, other nations have built other search engines, but Google today is probably the one that has been packaged in the most attractive and accessible manner, such that it has come to dominate the market. And this is just one example. So these are the four pillars, right? Codifying your innovation into accessible and attractive information channels is the fourth pillar, right? So there must be structure, there must be skills. The structure should create the basis for developing educated and skilled workers. And thirdly, there must also be systems for managing the innovation output that these skilled workers should have. Then we must now talk about transmitting them or translating them into a dynamic information infrastructure. Now, when India did all of this, right, when they identified these pillars, when I say did all of this, when they identified pillars, they now went on to, identifying the areas in which they were not doing so well. In other words, they did an assessment. And I remember saying last week that this is where we are going to begin. Why was it important for India to do an assessment immediately after all this? Why now they have identified the pillars? And I said, this is where we are going to start and this week. And trust me, this is a whole conversation on its own. I said next week, we are going to go back to why the work always begins with an assessment. What is the essence of assessing your nation based on key elements of the National Human Capital Policy that is supposed to drive your economic goals? And I dare say, I sense that this is where we are also going to stop this week, because this is a whole conversation on its own. Now, follow me very carefully. When you want to develop a national human capital policy, remember we've been looking at knowledge economy, and we took an example at India. We identified these four pillars. Why is it important to begin with an assessment? Why was it important to begin with a structure first? And why do you assess based on some structured pillars? Now, I was saying something last week. I said, remember, this is at the national level. That can be even for an organization that is a multinational represented, for instance, in 120 countries, can be a very daunting, quote unquote, behemoth to take on. If you have innovation as a true culture, I know some organizations that say one of their values is innovation, but if you look within, they don't have any systems for innovation, they don't have any processes for innovation, they don't have any rewards tied to innovation, and I can say they are just saying it, but they are not walking that talk. But if you truly, truly believe in innovation and you're committed to innovation, even at the level of a multinational organization, it can be a lot of work to harness all of this innovative output. First of all, to build the frameworks, remember the structure, and then to develop the people for innovation, and to now harness the innovative output that is coming out from, let's say, 200 offices across the globe, and finally to put it in the most attractive and compelling manner. It can be a lot of work. How much more for a nation that is sometimes made up of 200 million people, right? How do you build this system? Now, why is it important to assess is the question I said we're going to start with. But before we talk about assessing, it's important to also talk about why do we assess based on structure. I repeat, why do we assess based on structure? And the reason is because of the gargantuan nature of the details sometimes. I just give an example of 200 million. Just as an example, imagine you have a country and that country has 200 million citizens, right? And let's say you have either 36 states, as in the case of my country, Nigeria, or you have 50 states, as in the case of the United States, or whatever your example is. Now, remember that the last I checked in Nigeria, we have 774 local government areas. In the United States, I have lost count of the number of zip codes, right? And governance is at the local level. So how do you really harness the gargantuan information, the sometimes overwhelming information that can be coming out? That is why you need structure. The reason why you need structure is to ensure that you can be big enough to capture everything. I'll repeat that again. The reason why you need structure is to ensure that you can be big enough to capture everything, right? To ensure that you can be ordered enough not to miss anything. Anytime you see structure, you see order. Anytime you see order, you see optimality. Please follow me very carefully, right? The ideas that will be coming from 774 local government areas, or that will be coming from only God knows how many zip codes in the United States, not one of them has to be missed. Not one of them has to be to be suboptimized if there is proper structure, hence the need for pillars. The moment you are trying to do an assessment of where you are, before we even talk about why is it important to do an assessment, like we said, we'll begin with, we have to start talking about why did they even put these 4 pillars in place? Why was it that when India was going to do this assessment of its knowledge management capacity, they had to break it down and to say, let us look at it vis-a-vis these 4 pillars? Time you're trying to take on, anytime you're trying to do something at a mass scale. In fact, I will advise, even when you're trying to do something at a medium scale, right? Not to talk of when you're trying to do it at a macro level, even when you're trying to do it at a meso level, MESO, it is important to bring structure. Structure ensures order, and order prevents waste. I repeat, structure guarantees order, and order leads to optimality. Extremely important. So this is why India or the World Bank report working with India had to, or the World Bank report enabling India had to put that assessment into pillars. Don't forget that this is very, very important, right? Now let's go to the reason for the assessment. You must know where you are. Extremely important. Anytime you're working with an organization, and any consultant that knows his or her onions, right, would always begin the assessment after identifying either the pillars or the elements or the themes, THEMES, whatever name you want to call it by, something that brings some kind of structure. Immediately after doing that, the next thing you want to do is what you call an as-is assessment, AS-IS, an as-is assessment. Exactly where are we now in each of these things? Exactly where are we now vis-a-vis each of these pillars? Extremely important. If you don't have those pillars identified, you'll be scattered all over the place. But once you have had those pillars identified, once you have structured your overall goals into themes, right? Once you have the overall policy goal, let's go back to the example of India again. The overall policy goal was to do an assessment of themselves vis-a-vis their ability to transition to a knowledge economy. I repeat, the broad policy goal for India was to evaluate themselves based on their ability or vis-a-vis their ability to transition to a knowledge economy as the potential had been identified for. But having said that, once that broad policy goal is identified, you must now structure it and break it out into themes. Again, we would not recommend more than 5 themes. We'll often recommend between 3 to 5 themes, right? So I'm not surprised that they work with 4 themes. At Amogates, we would often recommend between 3 to 5 themes. 3 can be the smallest. For us, 5 should be the maximum. And many times the smaller, the better. I don't believe in having this optimum number again, right? Optimality is very, very important, right? Once you have that between 3 to 5 themes, so you have taken the overall broad policy goal, whatever it is that is the overall broad policy goal of your human capital policy. In the case of India, it was assessing themselves vis-a-vis the ability to transition to a knowledge economy. Once you have taken that, you must now break it down into themes. And like I was saying earlier, it is important to do an assessment. Very important. Some call it current state analysis, whatever you want to call it. Where are we now? The reason why you need to do that is because if you don't know, you cannot measure the gaps except you first do an assessment. So you look at where you want to be in each of these things. Again, as much as possible, you want to set this in quantifiable terms. Extremely important. For each of these areas, there must be metrics. There must be quantifiable metrics. Quantifiable metrics by which you will assess yourself as a nation in each of these themes, whether it is structure, the strengthening of the institution, or whether it is development of the educated and skilled workers. I'm just using this as an example, or creating an efficient innovation system, or ensuring that innovation outputs are packaged as attractively and accessibly as possible, right? Whatever it is that you want to translate your broad human capital policy goals in, it's important to break this down into a maximum of 5 themes. I would recommend a minimum of 3 themes. And then for each of these themes, I'm going a step lower, and I hope you've noted, we've gone from the broad policy goals to the pillars. That's the structure. We are now going a little bit more into the details, which lays the foundation for monitoring and evaluation and for measurement too. You must now translate this into metrics in order to be able to achieve that assessment. In order to be able to assess yourself as a nation, it's important to now have metrics for each of these pillars or each of these policy themes, THEMS, whatever you choose to call it. It's important to say, okay, for each of these themes that we have translated our broad human capital policy goal into, right, what exactly are the metrics? What are the metrics? Again, for the metrics, I would say you could work with 5, an average of 5. It can be more, it can be less, depending on the peculiarity of each of those themes. An average of 5 is what I would recommend, but that's not cast in stone, right? It can be flexible around it. But let's imagine you're working at an average of 5 metrics. You now need to gather evidence. Extremely important. You can't work with data that is what you wish it were. No, you have to work with the data as is. You're talking about a current state assessment. You're talking about an assessment of where you are. Extremely important. Why do you need to begin with this factual, objective assessment of where you are? Because you cannot transit to where you want to be as a nation except you know in factual terms, not assumed terms, except you know for a fact exactly where you are as a nation, right? So again, I go back to the question I closed with last week. I said why we are going to look at why it was important. Why does the work always begin with an assessment, right? Why was it important for India to assess the key elements of this pillar, the 4 key pillars of that transition from their potential as a knowledge economy to performance or actualization or optimization of that potential? Why did they have to do an assessment? Because you cannot even measure the gaps between where you are and where you want to be except you first know exactly where you are. And I've gone a little bit into the process of capturing where you are, right? When you're trying to capture where you are, after you have broken your broad policy goals into your your policy themes, it's now important to take those themes and also break each of those themes. You must now break it down into specific metrics against which you'll be measuring, and those metrics will serve as the basis for data acquisition. Of course, you will move from data acquisition to data monitoring, from data monitoring to data evaluation, from data evaluation to data interpretation. And that's where you begin to make recommendations, right? That's a whole conversation on its own again, but just be mindful of that process. You go from your broad policy goals into the pillars or into the policy themes. For each of those policy themes, There must be strategic metrics that you're measuring against, right? But before you measure, you're now going to data acquisition. You are gathering evidence. That is part of the process. The how, we've talked about the why. Why do you need to start from the point of assessment? Because you cannot even identify the gaps between where you are and where you ought to be, or where you're aspiring towards, which is your policy goal, right? You cannot even, identify the gaps or the steps. If you look at it as a gap, you say, oh, negative. No, well, if you want to put it in a positive manner, the steps, right? But the reality is that there are gaps between where you are and where you want to be. There were gaps between where India was in 2005, even though it had potential to be a knowledge economy. There were gaps between where it was at that point in 2005 and where it aspired to be. And they had to first do an evaluation and assessment to identify those gaps in measurable terms, hence the need for breaking even those pillars into metrics. My name is still Tolu Omadara. This is Amoge Radio Communications. We are looking at developing a national human capital policy this beautiful Tuesday, November 12, 2024. How are you doing? I hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. Now, I want to begin to say some things just to help us with, for those I don't know who may be listening to me, policy influencers, policy makers, who may be saying, okay, maybe it's time for us as a nation to also begin to transition into a knowledge economy, or maybe it's time for us to be putting together our national human capital policy. But I want to look this week as a way of rounding off from last week. I want to look at those who might be interested in the knowledge economy, right? Especially for nations who have that potential. I don't know, for instance, if such an assessment has been done of Nigeria, but I dare say Nigeria is also a nation with huge potential to be a knowledge economy. I'm going to do some research before next week to see if some assessment has been done on Nigeria. If some assessment has been done, I will share some of my findings. If no assessment has been done, I would also share my recommendations on how we can carry out such a valid assessment to look at where we can be, or to look at our potential to become a knowledge economy, and what can be the gaps and what can be the steps that can be set up to help us transition from potential to performance as a knowledge economy. But in rounding off today, I want to talk a little bit more about the characteristics of a knowledge economy, right? Don't forget, this is not just for the sake of knowledge. We are talking about absorptive capacity here. We are talking about the ability to translate that knowledge into social, economic, and social development, right? We talked about that last week already. So this is not knowledge for the sake of knowledge. This is not the days of, you're just knowledgeable, but you don't have resources. No, there must be absorptive capacity. The knowledge must be translated into economic and social development, right? So what are the characteristics of a knowledge economy? Well, the World Bank's pioneering report, for example, on knowledge-based development observes that today's most technologically advanced economies are truly knowledge-based. I'm going to say that again. This is just an example, right? The World Bank's pioneering report on knowledge-based development, and this is a 1999 report, observed that today's most technologically advanced economies are genuinely knowledge-based. So one of the characteristics of a knowledge-based economy, is that they tend to be more technologically advanced, and that is a strong reason to want to be a knowledge-based economy. Number two, this report also identified that these technologically advanced economies that are knowledge-based tend to generate new wealth from their innovations. Think of that word, new wealth. That's one thing I think we are lagging behind in a nation like Nigeria, right? New wealth. We have wealth, but do we have new sources of wealth? Today, the richest people in America are not the oil owners. Whether we like it or not, they are the innovators, they are the Bill Gates, they are the Jeff Bezos, they are the Elon Musks. Whether we like it or not, these people did not generate their massive wealth from traditional ways. It was new wealth taken to that one. And that's why I will be emphasizing from this point on in the program, absorptive capacity. We've talked a lot about knowledge in the last 3 weeks or so. Now we want to talk about absorptive capacity. How do you translate that knowledge as an economy, as a nation? How do you translate it into economic and social development. This is not knowledge just for the sake of knowledge. I'm going to repeat and I'm going to emphasize this is knowledge that must be translated into new wealth. So according to the World Bank, a genuine knowledge economy, a true knowledge economy, one correlates or there is a correlation between the knowledge in that economy and technological advancement. Very, very important, right? According to this pioneering World Bank report on knowledge-based development, most technologically advanced economies are knowledge-based. So if you are truly knowledge-based, I want to see your technological advancement. This is why I keep talking about innovation. I've been talking about innovation a lot from last week, even based on those pillars that the Indian society was assessed against. They had one of the pillars had to be about how do they channel the innovative outputs that are coming out from their skills. It's not enough to have institutions and skilled workers. Those skilled workers must generate innovative output. Innovation must more or less be compelled. This is extreme. And one of the things I have seen in our work in Amogate is that when organizations put up innovation management systems, like I was alluding to earlier, when they hire for innovation, when they train for innovation, when they measure for innovation, and when they reward for innovation, take note of that quick cycle I just shared. They hire for innovation, they train for innovation, the performance manage for innovation, and the reward for innovation, right? They hire for innovation, they train for innovation, the performance manage for innovation, and the reward for innovation. Once organizations do that, it is more or less guaranteed that a level of innovation will begin to flow because goals have been set already. Training is being directed in towards these innovation goals. Performance management is continuously going on, and people are also being rewarded on the basis of innovation. Same thing, I dare say, happens at the level of nations. Once the nation, as part of its human capital policy, has innovation elements. I've talked about the science and technology about 2 weeks ago, right? Now I want to talk about the innovative outputs. This science and technological research, this science and technological investment, and when I say science here, also put the social sciences there, right? Once you have this science and technological investment, it must translate into technological advancement. There must be innovation. And it is this innovation that will now help the nation to translate the knowledge generated in that economy into new wealth. I hope I'm making sense. This is extremely important. It's time for nations to get very deliberate. This knowledge is not for the sake of knowledge. That's why I began to talk about absorptive capacity last week. You must translate the knowledge into economic and social development, because one of the characteristics of a true economy, according to this World Bank's report, is that one of the characteristics of a true knowledge economy, according to this World Bank's report, is that a true knowledge economy also is technologically advanced. And because of this technological advancement, a true knowledge economy, the second characteristic, tends to generate new wealth from their innovation. I'm tired of Nigeria's largest source of income, as an example, coming from oil. I would like us to raise the next Zuckerberg. What about that? I would like the next Microsoft to come from Nigeria. We have the intellectual capacity. What we lack is a national human capital policy with a deliberate innovation segment that is channeled to ensure that we become a true knowledge economy where the knowledge is translating into technological advancement, and the technological advancement is further broken down to guarantee new wealth. Very, very important, because like I said, if you're not careful with innovation at a broad scale, it can be scattered all over the place. But once you have that innovation system, like that third pillar that the World Bank assessed India gave us a hint into, once you have that innovation management system, the chances of breaking down that knowledge and translating it not just into innovation but also into wealth becomes easier. Because like I said, it's one thing to generate a lot of scientific ideas, it's another thing for there to be absorptive capacity to translate those ideas into new wealth, which is the second characteristic, according to this World Bank report, of a genuine knowledge economy. Well, for the sake of time, the last characteristic I'll be sharing for today is that a true knowledge economy also tends to create millions of knowledge-related jobs in an array of disciplines that have emerged overnight. I'll say that again. One of the characteristics of a knowledge economy And the last I'm sharing today for the sake of time, of a true knowledge economy, one of the characteristics of a true knowledge economy, according to this World Bank report, is that it tends to create millions of knowledge-related jobs in an array of disciplines that have emerged overnight. Let me give you a simple example. Please, was there AI robotics engineer 20 years ago? Was there anything like artificial intelligence manager 25 years ago? Was there anything or like head of artificial intelligence policy at the governance level 25 years ago? I can go on, and that's just an example. So the third characteristics of a true knowledge economy is that they are creating millions of jobs related to this new knowledge in an array of disciplines that have emerged overnight. Don't you just want to fall in love with the knowledge economy as I'm talking? I can't wait to get my hands on creating a national human capital policy for my nation, Nigeria, or for nations of the earth. Include a deliberate innovation management policy, or to review existing human capital policies and to strengthen them so that we can begin to understand. I said a week ago or 2 ago, I said the greatest resources are the human minds. They are just yet to be optimized. I'll say that again. The greatest resources are the human minds, MINDS. They're just yet to be optimized. There is huge intellectual capital that is grossly underutilized because we have not identified. We just read the story of Jeff Bezos, and we read the story of Zuckerberg, and we read the story of Bill Gates, and we read the story of Steve Jobs, and we have not asked ourselves, why is it that most of these quote-unquote superstars have come from a particular nation? Have you noticed that almost all these names are from the United States? What have they done right with the national human capital policy? What have they done right with their absorptive capacity? What have they done right? I gave you some of the examples some 2 or 3 weeks ago. I said whether we like it or not, in digging into the research, I found out that most of the nations that have the highest wealth have been those with the highest number of researchers per 1,000 workforce. There have also been those with the highest number of PhD holders. Whether we are comfortable with it or not, these are the facts. Some people may, unintelligently or say, oh, but Zuckerberg dropped out of school. Do you know how much knowledge he gained before he dropped out of Harvard? Who told you the certificate is the knowledge? I was ready to drop out of school in my third year when I was doing my bachelor's, but for persuasion. But do you know how much knowledge I had gained? It's not about the certification. Don't be fooled. There's a lot of capacity that we will gain as nations when we have human capital policies that encourage higher education, but we must also ensure that we are translating the knowledge output into innovation that generates new wealth and millions of jobs. Well, it's on this note that I'm going to draw a curtain on today's edition of Development National Human Capital Policy. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. We look forward to hearing back from you. You can reach us on contact@theamogate.org. You can also reach us on Facebook, on LinkedIn. You can reach us on, we have a page on YouTube, Amoge Radio Communications. Please subscribe. There are lots and lots of information for you there, lots and lots of knowledge, new knowledge that we are also going to do our best to channel into new wealth. Also very important, we are also practicing what we preach, is what we do at Amoge. Please send us your feedback. We look forward to hearing back from you. And remember, we are available for your consulting needs, right? We do this, we've done this for public sector organizations. We've put structures, systems, policies, processes. Trust me, there's nothing we are talking about that we have not done in over 15 years of existence. We've done this and we keep getting better at it, right? We work with private sector organizations, we work with public sector institutions, we work with nations as well. We work with interregional organizations as well, right? We work with interregional bodies like ECOWAS. We work with development partners like GIZ. We look forward to partnering with you on your knowledge needs. Let's talk about helping you as an organization, as an institution, as a nation to garner new knowledge, to optimize new knowledge, to generate new wealth from it, and to ensure that innovation is optimized. I have to draw the curtain here, but before I do, remember we have wonderful programs running from Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. West African time. We look forward to hearing back from you. We'll be with you. I will be with you same time, same station next week, by God's grace, but there will be other programs running all through the week. Until I see you same time, same station, please keep thinking innovation, keep thinking knowledge management, and keep thinking human capital. The greatest wealth that needs to be optimized is in the human mind. Thank you and see you next week.